remember that this is the longest, speech in the book of Job. The shortest speech is found in chapter 25. It's all but 6 verses. And then chapter 26 begins Job's speech. And really, Job's speech in chapters 26 through 31 is really an answer to all that has been said about him from his 3 friends and all that he's been accused of. So in chapter 28, Job gives this discourse on wisdom, and that wisdom comes from the Lord. And he begins to say, that wisdom cannot be purchased. It can't be manufactured by the work of man's hands. That wisdom only comes from God and God alone. And then he begins in chapter 29. Some would say this is a summary defense. But what Job does is he reflects on the past. In a sense, you can say that chapter 29 really is Job's past pre-affliction days, his pre-affliction glories. This was Job reflecting on what life was like before tragedy hit, before, all this took place in Job's life. And when you look at chapters 1 and 2, we see really the depth of Job's loss. But what is added to his loss is the accusation that he is a man of sin. At least that's what his friends say. Remember, this conversation back and forth, it seems like we repeat the phrase over and over, but really this is what it is when you look from chapters 4 all the way to chapter 26. You'll see that it's conversations between Job and his friends are saying, there's no other way that you could possibly be doing or going through what you're going through if you are innocent. Job, you are guilty of sin. Just confess your sin so that all this can go away. They had no other way to view Job's circumstance. They said, this is the only thing that could be happening. Job, on the other hand, saying, you guys don't know what you're talking about. He wasn't claiming to be a pure righteous man. He was just saying, what you're accusing me of is not true. I have not done those things. And a couple of times Job's cried out and says, if there could just be a mediator, if I could just speak to God and he would respond. Remember, up until this point, God has not responded to anything that Job has said. So it leaves that area there where Job's like not hearing from God, and all he's hearing from is accusations from his friends. But on the area of wisdom, Job then begins to say that wisdom doesn't just come by human effort. He's telling his friends, listen, there has to be more to this. What you're telling me, though I agree, and he did agree for the most part, as to the fact that wickedness is dealt with by God, that wickedness is judged, and that yes, a person who lives a wicked life would most likely experience the things that he experienced. But Job was saying, I have not practiced wickedness, and so I think this is good. As you're taking notes, jot this down, because these arguments kind of build up to where we are. And then Job says, I would say he calls his friends in chapter 28 to consider that maybe God's wisdom was beyond their comprehension. And so that's what he kind of lays out in chapter 28, that God's wisdom is beyond their comprehension. So he ends on that. I like what he says in verse 28 of chapter 28, and he says, and to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. In a sense, Job is saying, listen, it's better to rest in the wisdom of God than the assumptions of man. And knowing what wisdom is, Job says, it would be foolish of me to think that I had not deserved any of this if I had practiced evil, but to depart from evil is understanding. So Job then further continues his discourse, and now as I said, chapter 29, a summary of defense. He furthers his discourse, and look at what he says here. As in the days when God watched over me. He's kind of taking him back, okay? And remember that Job says, all was well with me at one point, chapter 16 and verse 12. But perhaps the time of his affliction, as we see here, he kind of gives this picture here that there were days when the Lord had watched over him. But look at what he says. He says, oh, that I were as in months past. Now, this is the first time we get an idea of how long Job's affliction lasted. When we read the book of Job, and people always tell you, hey, you're going through something. Look at Job. Look at what Job went through. And nobody really ever asks the question as to how long did he go through this? This is about as close as we're going to get. So we know that it was, some would say a month and a half, some would say 2 months, some would say here, as it says, maybe just a few months. Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me, when the favor of the Lord was upon him. Oftentimes that is the idea, right? When we're going through afflictions, we always look back to a day when there was no affliction. But as Job is kind of giving this summary of defense here, he's really saying, these days, these pre-affliction days were some amazing times. And perhaps it's Job kind of looking back and maybe, I don't know, I'm just kind of giving you this thought, maybe in a sense he is perhaps maybe just kind of looking or considering, if you will, did I miss anything? Where did I go wrong, perhaps? Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me. And look at the picture and the imagery he's giving here. He says, when his lamp shone upon my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. In other words, the Lord guided me. Job said, the favor of the Lord was upon me, the days in which the Lord guided me and directed me. And really, that's consistent with Job's worship in chapter 1. Job worshiped God as if his life depended upon the God that he worshiped. And then the Lord would even further testify of that by stating that Job was a faithful man. God said Job was a faithful worshiper, that he was a faithful servant, that he was faithful in all that he did. As a matter of fact, the Lord used the words in regards to Job as that he was an upright man. I believe Job understood that it was God who made him that way. And it seemed that everything that Job offered up to the Lord, gave sacrifice for, was with that in mind. That Job understood that apart from the Lord, there was no righteousness in him. That apart from God, there was no good in him. And he says the favor of the Lord rested upon him. What an amazing thing to have the favor of the Lord rest upon you. But it doesn't take away from the fact that Job still doesn't have the favor of the Lord resting upon him. I mean, this is what the argument is with his friends, that the reason why the favor is lifted is because you're evil. And Job is saying, well, I know I didn't do anything that would bring this about. In a sense, he's saying, only God knows. And of course, God does know. He'll actually end on that note here in the close of this summary. But he goes on to say here, just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent. Job is saying, boy, those are some good days. The days when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent. When the Almighty was yet with me. In a sense, he feels like when he's saying this, he's saying when God was with me. Well, the Lord is still with him, but there's something that Job needs to learn as well, right? And that is, I think the learning curve here for Job is to understand that, just because we go through things, it doesn't mean that the Lord is not there. This comes from the Lord not responding yet. He will. But it's that whole idea, that whole picture. Remember, as we say, that we feel like the Lord's not there because he has not answered, right? So he says here, when the Almighty was yet with me. So this is only because he hasn't answered. So he's not saying that God left him, because it's not how it works. When my children were around, when his children were alive, when my steps were bathed, listen to this, with cream, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. So what is he saying? When there was days of plenty, cream and oil speak of, plenty. He says, man, things were good. When I went out to the gate by the city, remember that this was as the elders would do. So Job was saying this. He's saying, listen, I'm looking back on the days, and this was just not too long ago, the days where the favor of the Lord was upon me. God guided me and directed me in my life. The friendly counsel of the Lord was upon me, and it was evident that God was with me. My children were there. You could see here his affection and his love. Next to his relationship with God, Job, in his own words, puts his children in the list next to God. That's, I think, remarkable. We've seen how much he loved his children. It was for his children in chapter 1 that we see Job made supplication and prayer, right? Even if they committed a sin that they were not aware of, he was offering a sacrifice up for it. Talk about an example to you parents. This is what you should be doing. You should be praying for your children. You should be praying and interceding for them, and even praying over things that they could potentially be getting into. And Job prayed. Listen to this. Job prayed so passionately, so powerfully, so sacrificially, even when times were good. Sometimes people struggle to pray when times are good, not because good times are bad times, but because sometimes you don't really think you need anything when everything is going good for you. Oh, you struggle to pray. It's that thing we always say when something hits hard in our life. What do we say? Oh, I'm praying now more than I ever have. Well, you're a Christian, man. You should always be praying and speaking to the Lord. We're supposed to have a prayer life. You don't pray when things go bad. You're to pray with passion and expectancy and fervency, even when times are good. Job says, hey, man, the cream? I like that. I looked at that. I had to look that up. I'm like, boy, what does Job mean by cream? I thought that was pretty good. But the picture and the idea here is clear that days were really good for Job. The rock poured out its rivers of oil for me. When I went out to the gate by the city, Job was respected among the city leaders. Deuteronomy 21, jot it down if you're taking notes, in verse 19, and chapter 22 and verse 15. Remember that directive given to the elders that are to sit by the city gate and make decisions. Joshua chapter 20 and verse 4, the command for those to go to the elders at the city gate. Remember that's the story of Ruth. Remember that when Boaz went and asked, really, in reality, for the hand of Ruth. It had to do with another relative that had rights to the land. And the story is amazing. I remember one trip to Israel, we went to an area that is, it's an area called Tel Dan, Teldan. It's a nature reserve, but there's an area where they have like this. And it's real, like cobblestone, not this decorative cobblestone that people try to put on their house. Like, this is the real deal. You walk up on it, very slippery in wet days. But there's actually a city gate that dates back thousands of years. And not gate, as you would think, for you welders, wrought iron. No, it's a city gate. It's an entrance. And you could see, really, the divots in the stone that are carved out where the hinges of the gate rested on, so it would swing open and close. And as you walk in, there is actually a seat. It looks like a throne, but it's a seat where the elder and or elders would sit, and this is where decisions would be made. So in a sense, you have a picture of the story of Ruth there, and it kind of gives you that idea of how Boaz went and handled what needed to be taken care of. So the elders would sit at the city gate, and there they would take care of the issues that needed to be dealt with. So only men that were respected and had wisdom would sit at the city gate. And Job is saying this was the position that he had in the days that were before his affliction. When I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square, the young men saw me and hid. In other words, they respected him. The aged arose and stood. The princes refrained from talking. Listen to this. And they put their hand on their mouth. The voice of the nobles was hushed. Look at this. Young men who think they know it all. Aged men who believe they know it all. Princes who demand they know it all. And the noble ones. Those who are looked upon as the ones who know it all. They all kept their mouth shut when Job would speak. What Job is really implying here is he's saying all those of prominence and position and those that held a title or a position in his community, in his sphere of community, held their tongues. It says their tongues stuck to their roof of their mouth. When the ear heard, then it blessed me, and when the eye saw, then it approved me. So what is he saying? They all listened as he gave counsel, and they would take his advice, and they would listen to him. They would hear him. They wouldn't do what his friends are doing, accuse him and say, you know, Job, you don't know what you're talking about here. They respected Job so much that when the words of his voice were heard, and they seen the counsel, they respected Job and they listened. Because I delivered the poor who cried out. Job says, I lived a life before them that showed really this type of character. The fatherless and the one who had no helper, the needy and the orphaned. The blessing of a perishing man came upon me. I was there for those who were dying. And I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. The bereaving widow, Job, was there. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. In other words, my ways and my actions were consistent with righteousness. My justice was like a robe and a turban, something you can wear and would be proud to say, Job helped me in this situation. Job had a good name among his peers and his people, his community, and even among his family. And what even far greater than what man can say about you, God said Job was an upright man. Job is reflecting back on the privileges of life. See, in no way Job is saying, this is the man who I was. No, Job, I would say here, I believe that Job is saying, this is the man who God allowed me to be. He's the one that directed me. He's the one that guided me. He goes on to say, I was eyes to the blind. I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor. Look at that. Job dealt with justice and equity with all. And to the blind, as he said here, he was their eyes. To the lame, he was their feet. And to the poor, he was their father. And I searched out the case that I did not know. He was a listener. And not only would he listen, he would investigate it that I didn't know. I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from its teeth. Justice, he says, he dealt with in a way in which he would overrule oppressors. This is what Job did. Then I said, I shall die in my nest. In other words, Job had already settled in his heart that, I will be with my family. That's the term there. I will die in my nest. In other words, life is good. And multiply my days as the sand. I will live long with my family and live out the rest of my days. Look at what else he says. My root is spread out to the waters. He was prospering. His life was prosperous. And the dew lies all night on my branch. My glory is fresh. Listen to this. When he says my glory is fresh, he's talking about that he had an honorable reputation. My glory is fresh within me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. In verses 7 through 20, we see here that Job clearly is talking about an upright life that he lived before the Lord. And not only was it something that could be said of Job, but it was something that Job actually did. It was a life that he lived. And he goes on to say, men listened to me and waited and kept silent for my counsel. So in other words, his counsel was welcomed, but not with his friends. He needed to receive their counsel is what they felt. But look at this. He says, after my words, they did not speak again. And my speech settled on them as dew. They waited for me as for the rain. Look at that. They waited for me. In other words, they welcomed his opinion like soil drinking in the spring rain. And they opened their mouths wide as far as the spring rain. And listen to this. If I mocked at them, so acceptable was Job's words, and so acceptable was his character, his demeanor, his actions, and all that he was, so acceptable even to see among them, that even if he mocked them, they wouldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it. If I mocked them, they did not believe it. And the light of my countenance they did not cast down. I chose the way for them and sat as chief. So I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who comforts mourners. What we're seeing here is Job giving a summary of defense and how his life was like before his affliction hit. So in chapter 1 of the book of Job, when the Lord said this to Satan over this conversation concerning his servant Job, the Lord said, have you considered my servant Job, chapter 1, verse 8, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. Now, listen to this. Job in chapter 26 does not know at all whatsoever that God said this about him. Remember, this conversation happened in heaven. And then in chapter 2, the Lord once again says to Satan in verse 3, then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil, and still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. You see, in chapter 1, we see that all of Job's possessions, his children, his resources, his wealth, everything was taken from him. And in chapter 2, his physical body would be afflicted. But in both cases, the Lord said that he was an upright man, he was blameless. But in chapter 2, it says even after everything was taken, Job was still upright and blameless. Isn't that interesting? And in chapter 29, this is what Job is talking about here. He's saying this was the life. So this is what God was saying about him. Now, for Job's friends to hear this, they're probably cringing right now and thinking, no, this guy's a liar. There's no way you could live a life like this and have everything happen to you that happened to you. Job laments his present losses. He gives a contrast here. He gives this contrast to his present gloom. He says, but now, see, at once they respected me, but now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I disdained. to put with the dogs of my flock. Indeed, what profit is the strength of their hands to me? Their vigor has perished. They are gone from want and famine, fleeing late to the wilderness, desolate and waste, who pluck mallow by the bushes and broom trees, roots for their food. They were driven out from among men. They shouted at them as at a thief that had to live in the clefts of the valleys, in caves of the earth and the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed like donkeys. Under the nestles they nestled. They were sons of fools, yes, sons of vile men, and they were scourged from the land. Job will take this time to say at one point he was very respected. Everything he said was of great importance to others, and his words were respected. But he gives us an insight as to where this came from. He says it in chapter 29, that all this was a result of when the Almighty was with me. When I walked through darkness, he was there. Just as I was in the days of my prime, the Lord was there, he says. All of this clearly that God was able to do. But he says, but now the young men don't respect me. And it's not just young men, it's the vile, the worst of the worst. In other words, I have now become a byword to them. And now I'm their taunting song. Yes, I am their byword, and they abhor me. They keep far from me. Think about that. The most vile and wicked even feel that they're better than him. They do not hesitate to spit in my face, because he has loosed my bowstrings and afflicted me. In other words, he's saying, I am as defenseless as a bow with a loose string. What good am I? They have cast off restraint before me. At my right hand, the rabble arises. They push away my feet, and they rise against me. Their ways of destruction, they break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as broad breakers under the ruinous storm. They roll along. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud. So, Job here is not complaining in this situation, but he's giving a contrast between the two. Once a man who was respected by the young men, the old men, the princes, the noblemen, all those who had a position of prestige, respected, and when I spoke, they kept their mouth shut. Now my name is a byword, and they abhor me. Terrors are turned upon me. So he says here, no longer am I respected. We often just think about Job's loss of wealth. But we also see that Job, in the sight of men, has lost his position. Verse 16, he goes on and he speaks about the pain physically that he finds himself in. He says, and now my soul is poured out because of my plight. The days of the affliction take hold of me. Remember that there was much going on with Job in this time. We try to sum this up some time back and all that Job was experiencing. And in chapter 2 and verse 8, and Job's getting into his physical pain, but in chapter 2 and verse 8, there was intense itching. Now, we're not talking about just a little rash or a little, bump, a mosquito bite or something. No, intense itching. As a matter of fact, in the same chapter, in the next verse, there was painful swollen sores that itched. In chapter 2 and verse 12, he, by his friends, was unrecognizable. That's how bad the physical affliction upon Job in such a short period of time took place. Lasted for several months, as we've seen in verse 2 of chapter 29. In chapter 7 in verse 4, we see that Job was saying that because of his physical pain, that there was many, many days of sleeplessness. Can you imagine? In chapter 7 in verse 14, many nightmares. In the same chapter in verse 5, Job even says there's worms in his sores. Chapter 7 in verse 16, Job says depression set in. Chapter 16 and verse 16, he clearly says that there was much weeping and failing vision. Chapter 19, Job expresses in verses 13 through 17, having even bad breath, difficulty breathing in verse 18 of chapter 19, and rotting teeth and weight loss in chapter 19. Verse 20. Pain and peeling skin, we'll see here in chapter 30 in verses 17 and 30. Imagine all of that happening just to the physical body, but then you add to the emotional trauma in which he loses his children, he loses his livelihood, he loses everything that he had, and here he's saying, I even lost the respect among those around me. My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pain takes no rest. By great force my garment is disfigured. Listen to that. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. In other words, he's saying that the Lord has taken him like a garment because of what has happened. You remember that Job even says, because this has happened, he knows that God has allowed it to some degree. He says, I feel like a garment tossed in the mud. I become like dust and ashes. Some even take this reference to the ashes that he would have to gather to cool the pussing, boils and blisters on his skin. So he then begins to say that he feels neglected. All of this to say, in a sense, some would say here, Job in verses 20 and 21 and 22, that in a sense you can grasp that he abandoned some things spiritually, feeling abandoned by God. I cry out to you, and you do not answer me. I stand up, and you regard me, but you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand you oppose me. You lift up the wind and cause me to ride on it. You spoil my success, for I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for the living. What does that mean, the house appointed to the living? The grave. Right here, this is Job's lament to the Lord. I cry to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up and you regard me, but you have become cruel to me. In other words, I feel neglected. I feel left alone. And all of this is going to be dealt with when the Lord responds. But here we see that even as much as Job said, God, I can't believe you're allowing this, he never lets go of trusting the Lord. He'll express that in chapter 31. Abandoned spiritually, opposed socially. Verse 24. Surely he would not stretch out his hand against a heap of ruins if they cry out when he destroys it. Have I not wept for him who was in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me. Sometimes that's how some feel. It's like, man, I'm trying. That's that thing when people say, I try to do good, and every time I do good, something bad happens. That's what Job's saying here. This is why James says, consider the perseverance of Job as he went through this time of trial. And it's interesting, when people are going through trials, I know this to be true, because I've dealt with so many people. Yes, seek counsel, but seek the Lord's counsel when you're going through things. But when a person is going through great trial and they present it, at least this has been my experience. I don't know about you, if you've had people come to you, but it's always been that their trial is like the greatest trial in the world. Because they're the ones going through it. And you can see the desperation in, God, you're not doing something quickly enough. You're not fixing this right away. And, you give them some counsel like, well, maybe you should. And it's like they finish the sentence before you could even say, I already tried that. Maybe you should, I already tried that. Maybe you should, I already talked to them. It's like, well, then why are we talking? You should be talking to the Lord. Now, not in a mean way, but really, I mean, a person cannot fix your problems. A person can't. God might use them as an aid to get something done, but man cannot fix man's problem. Only God can. And circumstances in the life of the Christian are allowed. I think this is a good point to jot down. Circumstances in the life of a Christian are allowed so that we can rely on God because we are His. And there might be moments where we, like Job, reflect on the past days of our prime and the glory when it's like we prayed and bam, something happened. You hear things like that, right? Man, before I would just pray and God would answer. Now it seems like I'm not getting anything. But as we shared this morning in our study on a whole different topic and book, that in the Christian life there's mountaintops and valleys, and everybody wants the mountaintop experiences. Nobody wants to go through them. As a matter of fact, they push their friends in through the valley. You go there, I'll stay up here. Doesn't matter who you are. Mountaintops only come through valley lows. Eventually you'll get up there, but you got to go through here first. But here's the thing. So am I in a sense promoting to not seek counsel from friends? No. If they are prayed up and in the Word and godly and biblical, I think it's worth getting some prayer. But every trial is the same in essence, right? It's just different from person to person. But, it doesn't matter what it is. If a person struggles with a particular sin in their life or a feeling of they're low on their self-esteem, and I struggle with this, and so many people, there could be 10 people that are struggling with the same thing, but all of theirs is greater than the others. It's not. It's a need that you have in your life, and you're a child of God, and God will help you in it. Trust me. And then when He does, you know what we need to do? This is just a thought. But when God does meet your need and He fixes it, because He's faithful to do it, when He does, even if it's one little aspect of it, will you preach it just like you preached your affliction? Would you go to that person and say, God is faithful? Matter of fact, that might not be the only person. You probably went to 15, 20 people. But go back to all those 15, 20 and give God the glory. Don't be selfish. When God meets that need, you go and you tell the people that you hunted down, like, no, you're going to listen to me. Listen, just a thought. When the Lord does deliver, go and bring glory to His name. Amen? I think that's a good thing. We see at the end of the book of Job, it's great, trust me. The story ends well. We just got to get through the ugly. So, surely he would not stretch out his hand against the heap of ruins if they cry out when he destroys it. Have I not wept for him who was in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me. And when I waited for light, then came darkness. Look at this. Oppressed socially, exhausted physically and emotionally. Anybody ever been there? Job says, my heart is in turmoil and I cannot rest. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning, but not in the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry out for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. Listen to this. He says, listen, my life is so crazy right now. It's what he's saying here. And not only that, these are not, animals that are, that you would have as pets. Here's the point he's trying to make here. Yeah, I'm a brother to a jackal. I am a scavenger. I'm a, the picture, the imagery that he's giving here, and a companion to ostriches. These are not clean. These are unclean animals. But here's the whole point. This is the idea. My skin grows black and fails from me, and my bones burn with fever. This has to do with his physical pain. He says, my harp is turned to mourning, and my flute to the voice of those who weep. Exhausted physically and emotionally. He's saying, listen, this is a sad, sad song. And just when you think it's bad, it's in Job's case, he's saying it gets worse. Now, chapter 31. I have made a covenant with my eyes. And here what we see, Job delivers his final oath of innocence. And he says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? It would seem that in some way, Job was being accused, perhaps, of lust. Why Job brings this up, perhaps there was somewhat of an understanding that this is what they're saying to Job. The reason why you had to have done some type of sin, and Job's saying, I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment, listen to this, of God from above, and the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Look at what he's saying here. To look upon a woman in this way, being Job was a married man, he's saying here, does he not see my ways and count all my steps? God sees everything and follows every step that I make. And it seems that this was something very apparent. So he says he's innocent of lusting after other women. Remember, the only thing that we know about Job's wife is she asked him in chapter 2. Remember that? Are you going to hold on? Are you going to hold on to your integrity? Job says, you speak as a foolish woman. Should we not praise the Lord? Should we only praise the Lord in the good times? We should also praise him even in the difficult times, the point Job was making there in chapter 2. But notice this here. It's the only time we really hear. And some people say, what a wife who's carrying, her carelessness here in how she responds to Job. But you got to understand that she lost like Job did. She lost her children. And it's not her job to lead her home. It's Job's job to lead his wife in a difficult time. She asked from her heart what she felt. And even in then, Job, as a husband, corrected her thinking and brought things back to perspective. That we're going to worship God even in the midst of all this affliction and pain. What a good stance. And I love what Job does here. He uses the word if, and he uses it actually, you can count it 19 times in this chapter. And then he says, if I did do this, then let this happen to me. if I did, remember, because he didn't. But he says, if I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. So if I am, then let me be. Innocence of dealing falsely with others, because he was accused of dealing bad with others. He says, if I have done this, then the Lord will see to it. If my step has turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, then let me sow and another eat. Let my harvest be rooted out. In other words, let things be taken from me. If I did, then let it be. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, okay, he's denying adultery now, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. And let her be taken from me. Let me lose it all. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity deserving of judgment. For that would be a fire that consumes to destruction, and would root out all my increase. What is he saying? Man, adultery will ruin everything. And it does. Great loss comes with adultery. If I have despised the cause of my male or female servants when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? So in other words, we see here that he has affirmed fair treatment of his servants. Can anybody accuse me of wrong, that I've done anything? Now his friends are the only ones that are saying you had to have. They're not saying you done because he did do. They're assuming he's done. Verse 16, if I have kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself, so that the fatherless could not eat of it. But from my youth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he has not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless when I saw I had help in the gate, then let my arm fall from my shoulder. Let my arm be torn from the socket. For destruction from God is terror to me. And because of his magnificence, I cannot endure. Now, think about this for a moment. He's saying here that there is innocence in oppressing the poor and needy. It goes back to what he was saying in chapter 29 as he was speaking in regards to his respect and his honor and his, work among those that had need. And so what we see is that Job is saying, if I've done any of these wrong, if I have committed any of these sins, then yes, I should receive all that has happened to me. And in some cases, his friends were accusing him of some of these things. Remember, there was even a point where his friends said, the only reason why you had riches is because you took advantage of the poor. The only reason why you had what you had is because you took from others. And so he says, if I had, then let. If I had, then let this happen. If I have made gold my hope, or set to fine gold, you are my confidence. If I have rejoiced because my wealth was great. So he denies materialism and the idling of riches, idolatry, and materialism. And because my hand had gained much, if I have observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, so that my heart has been secretly enticed and my mouth has kissed my hand. What is he saying? Worshiping self, worshiping idols, giving glory to the work of his hand and his doing. This also would be iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above. Think about that for a moment. He's clearly stating here that not once did he ever consider all that he's had has been by the work of his own hands. That all that he has had in life prior to the days of his affliction was only given to him by the Lord. And he begins to close out this defense of his innocence, that he is innocent. He says, I never rejoiced over the misery of others. If I have rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up when evil found him. In other words, excited that they're the ones now getting it. Indeed, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul. He says, I didn't even pray and say, God, you get him. Sometimes we say that, God, you get him. Get him, God. Doesn't work that way. In a sense, he even says here to pray imprecatory prayers against his enemies. He's saying immediately no. He says, I didn't do that. Wouldn't do that. If the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? But no sojourner had to lodge in the street, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. If I have covered my transgression as Adam, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom. Boy, you see, he's saying, listen, Adam tried to hide his sin, but he couldn't. I love that, that whole picture here, And Job is saying, Adam tried to hide his sin, but God's seen it all. When Adam sowed these fig leaves, right? He did his very best attempt by the work of his own hand to hide his sin, and God says to him, Adam, where are you? It wasn't that God didn't know where he was. It wasn't the physical location that God was asking Adam where he was. God knew where Adam was. He wanted Adam to say where he was. And he got the answer out of him. He says, Adam, where are you? I'm hiding. Why are you hiding? Because I'm naked. Adam never had a problem being naked before. Who told you were naked? And we see how the story of sin entering the world unfolds. But what is Job saying here? He's saying, listen, if this was really a matter of sin, this would be easy. But this is why the story of Job is so difficult from Job's perspective, in the sense of defending his innocence, but also from his friend's perspective, because remember, this goes back to one thing that Job does. He calls his friends to consider that maybe God's wisdom was beyond their comprehension. But boy, they truly believed that they had God nailed down. He goes on to say here, because I feared the great multitude and dreaded the contempt of families, so that I kept silent and did not go out of the door. In other words, Job says here very clearly that he didn't rejoice over others' misery. He helped. When he's seen others in distress, even if their distress came upon them because of sin, he still would help them if they needed help. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Oh, that he had one to hear his. Listen to this. Job then closes with this longing that someone would hear him. Kind of goes back to, he's saying, man, if I can just present my case before God. He says, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me. That my prosecutor had written a book surely I would carry it on my shoulders. You know what he's saying? If I am guilty, if I were guilty, I would wear a guilty sign. I have no problem declaring my guilt, just as much as he had no problem declaring his innocence. Surely I would carry it on my shoulders and bind it on me like a crown. I would wear it. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. If my land cries out against me and its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without money or caused its owners to lose their lives, then let thistles grow instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley. Look at what Job does as he closes out this statement. There is confidence in his innocence before the Lord. And here's the whole point. Though we see Job constantly having to defend himself to his friends, Job never has to defend himself before the Lord. Job will even repent of some of the things that he said to the Lord when God had not yet responded. But all the while we see that Job never breaks character. He comes close in weakness and affliction. And if you've ever experienced the things that Job has experienced, and I have yet to meet someone on this earth that has gone through what Job has gone through. But I'll tell you what, for him to not break character is why James says, consider the suffering of Job. It's the closest that we can get to human suffering when there is no answer from God. Rather than there being comfort from your friends, there is accusation. But here's another thing. If you are innocent in a matter that you're being accused of, there's no need for you to defend yourself. That's another thing. Always know that if you know that there is no wrong that you've done and you've honored the Lord, who cares what others say? Boy, I've been accused of all kinds of things. My position as a pastor has been the most criticized and talked about, and that's okay. You know, some people say, I don't want them saying things about you. Who cares? Do you know that kind of looks good? It does. You're doing something right, so bring it on. I mean, at the end of the day, God knows the truth, and that's all that really matters to me. And that's all that should really matter to you. Amen? And in the same way that the Lord will vindicate Job, and he will. It's an amazing story. We're not too far. I was looking at it. I says, oh boy, now I could see why everybody told me, you're actually teaching through that whole book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. I said, yeah, up until tonight. We knocked out 3 chapters. So pat on the back for some of you, okay? But here's the point that, yes, we can learn from this. And one thing that I've learned so far is that if you're innocent and the Lord knows that you are, that's all that matters. Trust him and let the Lord be your defense.